All right. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you again for tuning in to our second day of our 2-day Peace and Justice event. Our interns have worked hard this year. I guess I should introduce myself. So, my name is Deja Garner, and I'm the Director of Equity and Outreach at Wave Educational Fund. And I have the pleasure of co leading our interns through this summer internship program over the course of 8 weeks. So each year during the internship, our interns are charged with putting together a public-facing event. It can happen in any shape or form, but this year they decided to put together an event full of wonderful content on day one, and then day two wanted to invite a bunch of special guests and experts in gun violence to contribute some insight and some perspective. And so we're super, super proud of them for putting on this event. And we also have Greg Jackson here, who will be providing his expertise and, like I said, some perspective and insight. And so I'm hoping that this will be a really fruitful conversation to end off our event. And again, thank you to all of our attendees, and thank you to everyone who is tuning in on Facebook. So we'll kind of get started with Greg giving us a quick intro of who he is, some of his background, and then, this is meant to be kind of a survivor-centered conversation. And so if you can give us a little bit about what it means to you to be a survivor, that's how we'll get started.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. And big shout out to the Wave Ed Fund and all the interns who made this possible. Thank y'all for all your hard work. Just a little bit about me. I'm someone who live in the Washington, D.C. area. I've been working in campaigns and politics for, about 13 years now. But while I was doing this work, about year three, when I was more focused on campaigns and advocacy around more general issues, I was caught in the middle of a crossfire myself and became a victim of gun violence in April of 2013. And since then, unfortunately, I learned firsthand, not only how painful this can be physically and emotionally, but also how victims are treated, especially in the Black community. For me, I was criminalized, even in the hospital as I was awaiting care. And, I'll never forget there were investigators who questioned me before I met my doctors and my nurse. And I spent the first 6 or 7 days in the hospital bed, couldn't even get a bath, and it was because of how my nurses perceived me, as part of the problem and passed judgment on me as a young Black man, and not actually seeing me as a victim first and recognizing that I was a bystander. But for them, I was defending my innocence, even in my healthcare. So that was traumatizing and also really frustrating. But as someone who kind of already had a political mindset, I kind of came out of it thinking, okay, what can I do? And how can we fight to change things in this issue? And so I started by just sharing my story. I spent about 5 years working in local government in DC, helping with everything from just basic community outreach to the implementation of certain violence intervention and prevention strategies. And then sadly, in 2019, one of our family friends in North Carolina was shot and killed in Greensboro. And I saw really the same story that I went through played out all over again, except he didn't make it. And there was no wraparound strategy. There was no progressive city budget that was looking at innovative ways to address violence. It was just policing, let's close the crime and let's move on. And that just didn't sit right with me. And so I kind of went from working at local level, implementing strategies and advocating, to joining the Community Justice Action Fund as their advocacy director, to really push for change at the federal level and congressional level across the country. So that's kind of how I got here and how my personal story, professional story kind of intertwined into what I'm doing now.
Thank you for that, Greg. And you actually kind of touched on the first question, the first official question that we have for you. And I know that you mentioned a lot about your professional direction kind of changing. Are there any other ways that the direction of your life kind of changed as a result of being a survivor of gun violence?
There were some good ways and some bad ways. I'll never forget when I was recovering. That's adult. When I was recovering, people would always say, "Oh, you're so lucky you made it." And I appreciated that perspective, but it kind of felt insensitive to kind of the pain and trauma I was going through, until I met another survivor of gun violence, and he shared that, your life will never be the same. It's going to be different from now on, but it doesn't have to be a worse life. And I took that to heart. And so for me, there was definitely a lot of emotional and mental challenges that came from going through that type of trauma. But beyond professional, I kind of took some other parts of my life more seriously. I started running. Never really was a runner, at least not after high school, and wound up running like 6 half marathons, and really getting deep into that. I started like creating different entrepreneurial projects, and I really just kind of had a closer, I guess, I don't know what the right word is, but it's like I guess a greater appreciation for life and a little less fear in like jumping out and doing things that I have an idea. Like I created, 3 or 4 businesses over the past few years. If I have an idea, I just go for it, because I know that, we can't take our time for granted, and I much rather fail than have the regret of trying. And so I've always kind of been, a little bold, but that kind of pushed me to a whole nother level of it. And so I think since then I've just kind of been brave enough to do what I thought was right or what I wanted to do, and not let kind of fear and doubt have as strong of a hold on me. But it has been tough. Even little situations, like I can be triggered pretty easily when I think about when I hear certain sounds, when I'm in certain locations, when people talk to me certain ways. A lot of that can take me back to that same kind of traumatic moment. And for me, my recovery was 6 months, so it was like a whole phase of my life that I had to fight through. And so, from time to time, I still get sucked back into that. And even my wound from when I was shot, it still has a lot of issues. So I have to put, medicine on it daily. And 8 years later, to have to treat your wound every day is definitely a stark reminder of, what I've been through, and frankly how it's still very present in my life.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your story. I think one of the things that I think that's something that people fail to realize when we have conversations about being a survivor and what being a survivor actually means, and the long lasting traumas associated with that, whether it's mental trauma or it's physical trauma. There are just so many things I think that are missing in the conversation. First of all, I don't think that we, involve survivors in certain conversations enough. And then secondly, we don't really fully understand what it means and what it takes to be a survivor every day. So thank you for sharing all of that insight. And so, again, I think you kind of mentioned some of these things already, but as we get more into a conversation around healing and what that looks like for you on a day-to-day, and I know that you said that there are still times, even all these years later, that can take you right back to, that moment. But when it comes to healing and your healing journey, are there anything specifically that you try to do? I know you mentioned your, marathons and just not necessarily not taking life for granted, but are there any other things in like your daily routine that you do on a day to day to just help you in your healing journey?
Yeah. Prayer is really important for me. I think one of the biggest moments for me when I was shot was just when the bullet hit 2 arteries. So I was going through this process of bleeding to death. And I'll never forget like that feeling of like fading slowly, like really literally dying slowly, and not feeling like I could go to God and feel, like I did my part. And so, I think God gave me another chance. And frankly, one thing that's a big part of my healing journey is to always connect with God and check myself and make sure that I'm living in his will for my life, based on this chance I was given. And I pray daily that if I'm not living in the path he wants me to live in, then course correct, just please course correct. And so that's been a huge part of this, is just trying to live in purpose, day to day. There's a lot I've done for myself internally because, you have to, for me, I've had to prove to myself that I'm okay, and so a lot of that has been through physical work, rebuilding strength in my legs and kind of getting my physical activity, my athletic activity to a point where I'm proud of where I am. And even little things like balance and all of that is just really tough. Um, but it's also been, it's also another part of my healing process, which I'm still growing in, is uh, how I perceive in other people. And I think folks don't necessarily think about that. I've been in a pretty bad car crash before, and I know what it's like to go through physical pain and kind of heal and go through that. But when you go through a car accident, yeah, you might be mad at the other car, but at the end of the day, it's an accident, right? When you're shot, like someone tried to kill you or kill someone, and so when you experience like another person going to that level of just a dark action or a violent action, it really shifts your perception of people, and so um a lot of what I've had to work on in my healing process is really to reset a little bit and not, try not to fall into that assumption that everyone could go to that violent place, but also recognizing that that's a reality and that's a real perspective that we have to keep when dealing with just other humans, and so it's like it's just hard when you get in an argument with somebody, for example. It's like I have to check myself because part of me sees it going all the way to that point and it might not actually be going to that point. And so I have to kind of check myself and kind of cope with even conflicts, and it could be like a fight at a flag football game, and you're just thinking like, oh my god, you kind of go to the worst on things. So there's been a lot of work on just um, healing my perception of humanity and kind of healing like my interpersonal perception of people, and just kind of reminding myself of the good in them. I've always been a very optimistic person, but that really like tested that perspective for me. That everyone has good in them and that everyone's coming from a good place because I felt it firsthand when someone wasn't. So that's been part of it too. And I think therapy is something I've been working on. I will say this is another part of the whole healing process that people overlook, but it's tricky to find a therapist who understands all that I've been through, and at least my perception as a Black man, there's a lot of people to talk to. There's a lot of people with good ideas and support. But as far as people who are professionally trained, it's a small group. And we have to do something about that because unfortunately there's a small community of therapists equipped, in my opinion, but there's definitely not a small number of survivors out there. There's millions of us. Um, so yeah, so that's one big area where I still haven't found like that therapist that can help me, uniquely navigate through this. So a lot of it has been kind of trial and error.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. And although I've never been physically, affected by gun violence, one thing that I always grapple with is just this idea of being a survivor and what that means and like who, and this is a terrible way to kind of put it, but like who gets to call themselves a survivor. Because I've lost a number of people to gun violence, really, really close folks to me to gun violence. And I've had an experience where somebody shot at my house just for kicks and giggles, literally rode by in a car, shot up towards my mom and I. We were outside and thought it was funny to watch people run. So I've been, I've had those experiences before. And so, I've never really known per se whether, to claim the title of survivor. But I will say that throughout my journey, I've realized that a lot of the healing is not linear. And there are different things that I've tried to incorporate into my own routine too. And so like going to therapy is something that I found to be semi-helpful. Sometimes, like you said, there are people who don't necessarily understand the trauma of waking up in the middle of the night and just like crying profusely because you are remembering the memory of a friend that you've lost or something like that. And so sometimes it's hard to find that that perfect routine. And sometimes we may never find that, perfect routine when it comes to healing and the journey. But I always appreciate just hearing what other things that, kind of folks do, because I'm also searching for my own ways to heal and really just go on this journey with other folks who have experienced it in a real way. And so
Yeah.
I think conversations like these are just super important to have with one another.
Yeah. And I think, you are a survivor in my eyes, right? And I think what has happened to like and it's rampant. Like with gun violence, we tend to oversimplify it and we just clump everybody one bucket. And I think what I've been through is very different from a mother that's lost their son, and it's very different from someone that maybe attempted suicide, and survived, and it's also very different from someone who was, in a mass shooting or in a school shooting, and I think that we too often we just we throw every survivors all in the same pot, and we assume that we all can connect and that our stories are all similar and that our process is all similar, and it's very complex and very very different. There's been so many times where I've been on a stage or in a room or in a panel, and I felt like I couldn't relate at all with the other people who were there, but we were all clumped into being survivors, and the things that we were saying and the things that we were feeling, like the pain and trauma, yes, you can connect on that, but beyond that, our experiences were so different, and the solutions that we need to see in our country are very different based on what people have been through. And I actually strongly believe that every Black person in America is at some level a survivor of gun violence, because I look at like my life, and as a child, our heroes were shot and killed. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X gone. You know, Meg Evers. Like Fred Hampton, like gone. And then as you get into a teenage, you start listening to music, and then you lose Biggie Smalls and you lose Tupac. And I remember exactly where I was when these people were shot and killed. Traumatized by that. I know exactly where I was when Tupac was killed. I was in the trunk of my aunt's Pathfinder. We were on a trip to go to Chuck E. Cheese, and two of the kids was in the back, me and my cousin Corey, and we heard the news, and we were just devastated. Knew exactly what happened where I was when Nipsey Hussle was killed and Pop Smoke, and it's like, well, what world are we in where I've lost so many people, around me just from a entertainment or civil rights or personal heroes or athletic or, every spectrum of our community has been destroyed by gun violence at some point. And this is way before I was shot. And so I just think like we as a community have been kind of trapped by this crisis, and there's layers to that. And I think a lot of times we don't, especially in the gun violence prevention movement, we don't really see all those layers, nor do we appreciate all those layers, and nor do we think about those layers when we're advocating for change. And I think it's really hurt us, because when we prioritize one person's plight, we deprioritize others. And I think we've done a lot of clumping folks together and then just pushing one policy that helps one group, and I don't know, man. So like I said, I do think you're a survivor. I think there's way more survivors in this world than the people who lost a relative, or the people who've been physically shot. And we have to think about what that means for the future and what that means for the journey to healing, kind of as this conversation is about. So, but I'm not sure how we get there yet. I just think the first step is just acknowledging that and getting the movement to start to see it in a little bit more complex way, and appreciating the different angles of it, and being intentional about change in all those areas.
And I that actually gets to our next question about centering the voices of survivors and how we are doing that as a movement. Like if we do that enough, if we can do better, because I know for me, I've been in gun violence prevention in an official capacity since the beginning of 2020. But prior to that, I would try to do, my own work in the community, just as a result of me being sick and tired of losing my friends, my close friends, to gun violence at such a young age. And I'm 27, and I am running out of fingers. I've ran out of fingers. I would probably need a couple of, your hands and a couple more to really count the number of people who I know personally who I've lost to gun violence. And so, even since starting my position at Wave, losing more than 5 folks just within a year, and we were in a pandemic, and so when it comes to that conversation, like you said, realizing and recognizing and appreciating the different ways that being a survivor can look and what folks bring to this movement, that's kind of, again, the next question of how is the gun violence prevention movement doing when it comes to centering the voices of survivors, and can we do better with that?
Yeah, I think hmm, I mean, I don't think the movement has done a good job historically of centering survivors. I think we've centered survivors as, well, one, we've used the term victims for too long. And so we say, here are the victims, and we know the solution. That's kind of how I've seen GVP kind of play out for a long time. It's like they're the ones that are hurt, and we're the doctors, and here's what the solution, versus looking to the people who've been hurt and impacted and saying, what do you think? We did a lot of, over the years, prescribing policy solutions and prescribing things we think should be different without actually talking to the patient, and so I think I do think there has been a big shift though in the last 5 years from my experience, where survivors have kind of gotten fed up with the whole, of being like the horse and pony show, and having to go to Congress and share their story, but then walk out the room when the policy is being made. And I think it shows, because I think actually our stories are the most powerful tool the movement has. And if we don't put the stories first and put the people with those stories at the front of the room, then we are going to be just like an anti-NRA type of nonprofit. They have force and numbers and money, and maybe people, but they don't have real stories. And we have real stories. One story can cut through, millions of dollars, in my opinion. One story can take out hundreds of organizers and thousands of voters, So, but we have those stories. So we're starting to see a lot of those stories step up. And I think for every person who steps up in its own way, I have to think it inspires another. And if we can start inspiring people who've been impacted to really step to the front of the room and be a part of these solutions, we'll literally have millions of advocates. I mean, literally, there's way more survivors of gun violence than there are, pro-gun right-wing advocates out there. But the survivors have not been empowered yet at any scale. And I think when we can get over that hump somehow, and I think it starts with survivors telling stories and leading the charge, but when survivors could start recruiting more survivors and communities start to recruit more communities, then we can build the political power we need really fast to do whatever we want. I will say one thing that we've tried to do in 2020, we ran a program called Elect Justice, and our whole focus was, how do we build electoral power in neighborhoods that have been traumatized by violence? And it actually worked. We knew that when we reached out to folks with this issue and said, this issue is important to you, we know, and here are candidates, or this is why you should vote. We didn't say which candidates, but you should vote because this issue is important and these people can, make or break this. We saw a huge boost in turnout. And so I think there's some motivation, once we light a fire under people, to build that political power, and voting is kind of like the floor of it. But then the next level is like, okay, we need you to, come to a hearing. We need you to run for office. We need, I think there's a lot more we can build on if we really start to pour into survivors, not as just the victim stories, but as the real engine behind the organization, or the real engine behind the movement. So that's how I feel about it. I don't think we've centered people yet, but I think we're doing a lot better. And I think there's groups like Parkland and March for Our Lives that are completely survivor led. Our organization is now survivor led, and so I think there's kind of a transitioning happening.
Yeah, that's great perspective of just the historical context of the gun violence prevention movement and how prescriptive it has been in the past. I think that's a huge point to kind of bring up, and a huge narrative to bring up, because I feel like, especially for folks of color, that happens a lot, not just with gun violence, but with a lot of other things, whether it's food choices or something like that, or like health and some of the struggles that with health that some communities have. People say, well, just eat better, or buy better food, and not really realizing that it's not that simple. And
Right.
so you did speak about the power of like civic engagement and getting people involved politically. Are there any other things that you advocate for when it comes to solutions to gun violence?
Yeah. So I really think the ground floor is starting to invest in programs we know work. And so that's been our number one push is how do we get the federal government, states, and cities to start to put some money around healing and supporting communities that have been traumatized. And I think that starts with just victim services and programs that target those who are most at risk. But I think that should evolve into, okay, how do we heal this entire community and make sure the 4-year-olds on the swing don't become the 17-year-old survivors or victims, right? And I think that's the next phase of it is looking at the root causes and really putting pressure on leaders to start to attack those root causes and change that. And so I really think there's kind of a band-aid we can put on right now, but then there needs to be some real surgery done on how our government and our leaders have dealt with and invested in Black and Brown communities historically. And the motivation seems to be there from them. They want the violence to stop. They want to make sure their neighborhoods are safer. Well, there's real ways to do that. And you could either deal with the access and the hardware, which I think America should have did 50 years ago. It's a little too late now. It's over 400 million guns in America. And there's 360 million of us and declining, unfortunately. And so the guns are already here. So if you want to change that, we're a little late to the party. I mean, we can help, stem off the supply for the future. But at this point, most neighborhoods are saturated. And so we have to think about how do we heal and how do we work with communities to make sure that just because you have access to a firearm doesn't mean you go out and just kill someone or ruin your own life attempting to. So I think a lot of that comes from investment. And then I do think there needs to be some serious accountability and crackdowns put on manufacturers, on gun dealers, and anybody who's been pushing firearms into our communities, because it was very strategic and it's been very destructive. And if we really see this as a public health crisis, we can't just blame the individuals that are using something harmful. We have to look at who's supplying all of this. And if we look at gun violence like we did the opioid crisis or any other public health crisis, we don't just point at the person that's sick. We point at who brought this here and how and why. And right now we have a corporation, or we have an industry that's making billions of dollars a year off of fueling firearms and fear into our communities. And no one stepped up to put any regulations, any accountability, any of that. And so I think that's another huge thing that we have to fight for. And I think the other thing is we also have to look at, what is our accountability system? Because if our accountability system is purely policing, then we need to make sure that that's working for us. Because if it's not working for us, which we have seen happen, then we're going to make the problem even worse. If people don't feel comfortable that they can go to their accountability system and seek justice, then they're going to take it into their own hands. And we've seen that work, and we've seen people do that, and we've seen how terrible the outcome has been. And on the flip side, if that system is functional, is it helping and not harming more people than it's actually holding accountable? And so right now we have, in my opinion, 3 big battles. It's like, how do we help the people, get out of the address the behavior and the root causes and everything that fuels people acting out violently? How do we crack down on the supply chain of firearms that are being pumped into our neighborhoods and hold people accountable for what the damage has already been done? And then lastly, how do we build an accountability system that we all can believe in, especially as Black folks, I mean, we know what police were created from slavery. That's history, right? That's a fact. And so we already starting from a deficit with this accountability system. And so if we really want to build trust in the system, then we have to create something, I think, that people can really believe in. And it may not be just a reform here, reform there. It may need to be something more transformational. But at the end of the day, I think we got to think about, is the goal accountability, or is the goal to keep this institution in place that we're attached to? And I really think in America, it's more about the institution than the actual function. And we got to figure out how to get over that hump too.
Yeah, I think those are all fantastic points, especially the one about manufacturers and going upstream. And I know that those are conversations that we're having at Wave. Like, how do we peek behind the veil, because the manufacturers are the folks that like set the fire and get to go running high, right? And so a lot of people, I mean, they're almost like Big Brother, where they're there, but nobody really realizes it and realizes that, that's where it's all kind of trickling down from, is the lack of accountability for manufacturers, and the fact that a lot of their work is completely unregulated, and folks just don't realize that when we
Yeah.
have certain conversations.
And look, if they're not going to regulate, there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? Like, okay, if they're going to just run wild, then maybe we create our own system, or we figure out the alternatives and really build them up. If the alternative is, I don't know, Vivid security systems, then maybe we build a partnership with them and figure out how can we build the community of people who have security systems to protect their homes versus firearms. If we know that the hunting community is our biggest battle, then how do we partner with folks who are using bow and arrows? Or why don't we build a partnership with the fishing union and get the fishing union to really step in and hold the hunters accountable? But I think we have to really think, like, we got to start thinking about that whole industry and holding them accountable to doing what's right. And if they're not, just like everything else, we create an advocacy plan to either pressure them to do the right thing or build other ways for us to hopefully address this crisis. But I think we haven't even I don't think we've put enough brain power into this and how to even approach that part of it quite yet. Some organizations definitely have, but as a collective movement, I think we really got to take time to think through that, and build campaigns for it.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. And so shifting gears just a little bit, and we only, have a couple more questions for you, but shifting gears just a little bit, what has been the kind of most meaningful or impactful moment for you as a survivor after, kind of this entire conversation and things that we talked about and some of the, memories and things that you look back on? What has been, some of the most powerful, one of the most powerful moments for you?
I think just two quick moments. So one, when I was shot, and I think a lot of people can relate, being in the hospital and recovering is an extremely powerless, vulnerable place to be. And I hated it. I hated it with the vengeance. Like, I hated being vulnerable and not being able to do anything for myself, and not even not let alone change. I couldn't make political change. I couldn't even get to the bathroom. I couldn't even like stay awake for more than 30 minutes the first couple of days. And so to turn that into what I'm doing now, where we literally have built political power to influence policy and to be able to meet with the White House and meet with Congress and meet with different governors and mayors and really start to see change, that has been just a beautiful circle, I guess, or transition in how that trauma impacted me. It went from something that made me powerless to, I think, in a lot of ways has, granted me the opportunity to be powerful. And so that was beautiful. The other thing that was tough, I lost in this fight. I work with some kids in my neighborhood, and one of them was actually shot and killed. And he was someone who was very vocal about ending gun violence and helped organize a Stop the Violence event in our neighborhood. And then he was shot and killed a few weeks later. And that just has always haunted me. And he, his spirit and his story has always been really hard for me to just to deal with, even to this day. And his best friends are growing up now. And so to see like his best friends growing up and moving on in life and going off to college and all of that has been really painful to watch, but a little bit liberating. And I think one of my greatest moments was being able to take his best friend Fred and his best friend Cubante to Congress when we introduced the Break the Cycle of Violence Act. And they were standing at the podium. You know, they didn't speak because they didn't want to speak, but they were standing there with members of Congress. And it was just really powerful to see members of Congress who are legends in their own political right, you know, standing next to these youth who had lost somebody they love and care so much about. And that was a beautiful moment because I could see like the pride in their chest, but also the pain at the same time. And I wanted to be able to give them a little bit of what I had, you know, about dealing with that trauma, but still being brave enough to stand up and fight for change. And so that was a beautiful moment. And I'm glad we were able to do that and kind of hopefully inspire them into the next phase of their lives. And so that was nice.
Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss. I know that it's tough anytime any young person, you know, experiences gun violence in that way that ends in tragedy. But I think when you have a personal connection to that young person, it makes it, you know, even worse, and it makes it even more like even more tragic situation. But I'm happy that you were able to take, you know, his best friends and kind of use your platform to give them some exposure to being part of the solution, because I know that, you know, for young people, they are at the highest risk for gun, you know, homicides. And so it's super important that people realize that and recognize that and just know that young people are out here hurting and looking for ways to do things to change their lives. And a lot of times they're just not afforded those opportunities. And so that's super, super dope that you were able to do that for them.
Yeah, it was a nice moment.
Yeah. And so our final, you know, kind of question for you is actually just for you to share any final, you know, kind of thoughts or anything that you'd like to leave with survivors who are watching, or people who have, you know, the story of survivorship in any type of way, any, you know, connection. Look at me. Connection has been a long day. Connection to gun violence. What are some final thoughts that you have for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think just it's just really important to embrace your story and tell your story. And it doesn't mean that you need to be in a congressional briefing or something like that. But, you know, a lot more of us are suffering from this than we know or that we can acknowledge. And sometimes just your story of how you're surviving and pushing forward can really encourage and support someone else. And frankly, don't underestimate your solutions and ideas because, you know, it's the people closest to the fire that know how to put it out. And so if we're not speaking up and saying what's needed to be done, then we're allowing people way on the other side, you know, far away from the problem to try to prescribe things upon us. And that's failed for decades. So I would also recommend that. And then lastly, I mean, again, it's, you know, life is short and pain is real, but you got to keep pushing and growing and thriving. And so, you know, don't feel guilty to be happy and to live your life and to really grow and blossom in what you want to accomplish in this world. Because it's definitely easy for that trauma to be a cloud that follows you. But, you know, you can really turn that into, you know, a lightning bolt that helps you reach your goals. And so, you know, just don't give in to that very easy thing to do of just giving into the pain and trauma, but really, you know, use it as a stepping stone to do something impactful. You know, I really believe God puts us through things for a reason, and it's not necessarily easy, but you know, it's part of the plan. So.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful note to end off on, Greg. And I appreciate you so much for being here. I know that you are extremely busy and your time is really limited. And so I thank you so much and truly appreciate you coming to share your insight with us and your perspective with us. And I know that I can say this on behalf of our WAVE, you know, staff and our interns and internship program. They truly appreciate your time and you being here. And so thank you to all of you out there who tuned into our 2-day event. Again, I hope this was a wonderful way to end everything off. We are going to keep these videos out on Facebook if you'd like to go back and rewatch them and have access to them in the future. I hope that you all continue to tune in to what we're doing at Wave. I hope you all continue to tune in with CJAF and the things that Greg has going on over there. Super powerful organization and one of our closest partners. And so we truly appreciate everything that they do. And we truly appreciate you all again for tuning in and giving us some of your time tonight. So everybody have a great night and be safe and be well.